Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's DEI lecture, Stereotyping, Implicit Bias, and the Experiences of Women and Underrepresented Minorities in STEM. My name is Sarah Pozzi. I'm a professor of nuclear engineering and the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the College of Engineering. Michigan engineering is in the midst of a culture shift. We're interested in making our community more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive. And these DEI lectures are a part of that effort. It's my real pleasure today to introduce Professor Denise Sekaquaptewa, who will be giving today's talk. Dr. Sekaquaptewa is the University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor of Psychology here at the University of Michigan. Her research program is in experimental societal psychology, and it focuses on stereotyping, implicit bias, and the experiences of women and underrepresented minority in science and engineering. Her program has been funded by the NSF. Dr. Sekaquaptewa has received many awards, including several awards for her work on diversity-related issues, including the Harold Johnson Diversity Service Award and the Sarah Goddard Power Award. Her current research focuses on how gender stereotypes affect the experiences of women in science, technology, engineering, and math fields. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Professor Sekaquaptewa. Please.
All right, great. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks everyone for coming out to the talk today. It's really a pleasure to be here and talk with all of you about these issues. As Dr. Pozzi said, I'm in the Department of Psychology, where I do experimental research on the topics related to diversity science, experiences of women and underrepresented minorities with a focus on STEM fields. And so I want to talk to you today about those issues, what social science research has focused on and uncovered relevant to those issues, and also including some of my own personal research on these areas. So in today's talk, I'll cover these 5 steps, starting with diversity in the academy, talking about research on stereotyping and implicit bias. Then on the flip side of that, what is it to be the target of those biases, and the role of stereotype cues around us, and finally thinking about what can we do. So to start with diversity in the academy. These are some statistics relevant to all of you, I believe, in engineering. These are taken from some recent NSF reports. And to orient you, this is the, on this side of the left side of the graph is % women who are getting in the doctoral degrees in the top section, master's, and then bachelor's degrees in the bottom section, with the dark blue bar being 1998, the green 2008, and the light blue 2018. So I think you can take away kind of a piece of good news is that across the 3 levels of degrees, that generally women's percentage is getting larger, right? So in 2018, there's an increase compared to the earlier years across all of the degree levels. The part that's not so great is that they're all relatively low percentages, right? So really being at approximately 25% or fewer women getting these degrees. It's a percentage that psychologists can recognize as being one where you still feel like you're standing out, right? In terms of gender. You can feel still quite underrepresented at 25% of a population, or lower than that. So so that's the not upside of this. Let me show you another one, which is about it's basically intersectionality. So these are underrepresented racial minorities, which include Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, American Indian groups, sorted out by men and women. I should say that this graph doesn't include Asian and Asian American people, which I don't mean to leave out, but because certainly they are also the target of various forms of bias, but the NSF hasn't included them in the category of underrepresented racial minorities. But to orient you to this graph across the years, the dark or the blue shaded bars are for doctoral degrees. The green is master's and the purple are for bachelor's degrees. And within each degree level, the darker shaded line, a darker hue line is women's data. So what's interesting to me is that at every level of degree, the percentage of women is higher than the percentage of men for these underrepresented racial minority groups at every level. So leaving that the underrepresented racial minority men in the doctoral degrees being the lowest represented group. Again, you could see some slight upward trends over time, but the percentages themselves tend to fall at approximately 14% or lower for every group of male and female members of these three underrepresented racial minority groups. So we're talking a very low percentage here. So you can see that there's a lack of diversity really in engineering fields broadly across the country. Why would that be an issue? Why should, is there something really wrong with that? Why should we care about diversity? I can think of a few reasons here that I'll go over with you that are important reasons why we should care about and want to do something about a lack of diversity, right? One is to think about our increasingly diverse student body, as the students are more and more diverse, they're looking for faculty members who are like them, right? Who can serve as positive role models to them. So a diverse faculty will benefit an increasingly diverse student body. Otherwise, you may have underrepresented students thinking, oh, engineering, it's interesting, but it's obviously not for me, right? Because there's nobody like me doing this that I can see. So that is one benefit. Another one is some social research indicating that these more diverse teams actually can have better outcomes. Right? You can work together and come up with more innovative solutions to problems. And a lot of this is attributed to people when you're working amongst people who are different from you are, kind of bumps you out of your comfort zone a little bit, get you to think more broadly, get your mind in a different place compared to when you're working with people who are very similar to you. Finally, there's some work on being in the numerical minority, that is being a member of one of the groups that's very underrepresented, and how it can have a negative effect on people. Certainly, part of that effect can be sort of climate related, as when women walk into a room and they're like, okay, here I am again, the only woman in the room, and wondering why that is. But in some of the work that I've done that I'll talk about in a little while, we've actually demonstrated experimentally a negative effect on performance for students from underrepresented groups when they are in a situation where they're the only person of that, let's say, racial ethnic group there, compared to if there are others of their same racial ethnic group present. So I'll talk more about those in studies in a little while, but certainly there is reason for us to care about the issue of increasing diversity in our fields of study. There's a lot of talk about the leaky pipeline in STEM. That's a phrase I'm sure everyone is familiar with, where at every stage, from undergraduate student to graduate student to postdoctoral fellow and so on, you see the dropout of women or the dropout of racial ethnic minority people. And so ultimately, as people progress in the fields, they find themselves in increasingly situations as you progress, there's fewer and fewer of women and racial minority people present at the most top levels of one's career, leading us to wonder, well, what accounts for this leaky pipeline? Why is it that people are not progressing, not persisting to have, to engage in the higher levels of participation in these careers? Lots of people have, researchers have talked about reasons why. Some people have focused on what I would call internal factors, something about those individuals themselves. For example, maybe women and underrepresented racial minority people just have different interests and fields, and so they just have less interest in STEM fields. Maybe that leads them to choose something else. And if it's people have free choice, like to choose their majors and their careers, then, and if they choose something else, what are we to do about it, as engineers? There's even been talk of differences in abilities and performances, that maybe some groups just simply don't have what it takes to do well in these STEM fields. There certainly has been discussions like that. Social researchers tend to focus more on the social context, the influence of a social setting and the various factors there, what we would call external factors, external to the individuals. And a lot of this can focus on features of those environments that really promote or make salient stereotypes about who belongs and who does well in STEM, and also contributes to implicit biases. So there are features of STEM environments that can promote these biases, and they in turn, this is where we really focus in social psychology, is how the social context, how those external factors actually influence people's interest in a field or not, whether they choose that to engage in and persist in that field, and can even influence their performance in that field. And so that's the approach that I take in my work in these areas. So let me move on to our next section about general research on stereotyping and implicit bias is conducted by social scientists. So STEM stereotypes. We've all heard the term stereotypes. We kind of know what that means. Psychologists really talk about it in terms of cognition. That is, it's our beliefs that we have and what we assume to be true about the traits and characteristics and abilities of other groups. They exist about all social groups, right? Not just minority groups. Every social group has stereotypes about it. So of course, there could be stereotypes about people who work in various occupations. So we have these stereotypes about science and scientists, about engineering and engineers, about psychology and about psychologists, and about who's suited for all of these fields. These drawings I will show you were produced in a study using 7th graders, where they asked them to draw a scientist, right? And so this is the kind of image that these students drew, and you can kind of see some fine artistry, I will say, but also some consensus in their image, right? For example, the white coat, it seems to be a consistent theme, and also in some, I would say that of course they're all male, right? And so there's some one thing about stereotypes is they do have this sort of consensual nature, that within a society, within a particular social context, people tend to have the same sort of image consensually held, in this case about scientists. I tried to look up if there was one about draw an engineer in a similar study, and there isn't really as much, well, there really isn't that much about studies on draw an engineer. I imagine if they did, maybe it would be something like this. I talked with someone who many of you may know, who's Laurel Meadows, who used to be the assistant dean there at the College of Engineering till she went and moved up to Michigan Technological University, but we still collaborate on a lot of research in this area. And she told me that when people are asked to draw an engineer, you often see something more like this, like a train engineer, as opposed to another engineer. So I always thought that was kind of funny. But I think that going back to this image is that, again, I think that when people think about engineers, they have a consensually held image, right? Again, maybe the hard hat, the maleness and the whiteness that is sort of the first image that comes to mind for a lot of people. Again, a consensually held image about not only what these people look like, but also what they are like, right? What their characteristics, traits, and abilities are. So where does all this come from? Why do we all wind up kind of having these images that are shared about engineers, for example? These stereotypes really come to us by a lifetime of experiences being exposed to particular messages that support those stereotypic images. This is a book from probably, I guess, the 60s, a kid's book. Because it's hard to read the captions, I wrote them again here. So the caption for this picture of a boy making a model airplane and a girl, I think she's holding a dish, is that boys fix things, girls need things fixed. Another page in that book. Boys invent things, girls use what boys invent. Right? So you can imagine if you kind of grew up with these kinds of books, or this is your bedtime story at night, that you can wind up having a certain message about who engages in these in fixing things, inventing things that are critical to many STEM fields, right? This is related to the idea of schemas, where schemas are sort of our sets of knowledge that we have about people and objects and things, and a schema about a social group, a set of people, either by their gender, their race, their occupation, all of those. We can have schemas about these at our another word for stereotype basically is a schema about a group. So we develop them over time. We tend to use them in our reactions to and judgments and evaluations of other people, often because they allow for us to make sort of a rapid decision about somebody. It facilitates information processing to rely on this stored knowledge instead of trying to figure out each individual person sort of from the ground up, right? We can just call upon what we think we know about their group. Of course, this allows for rapid information processing about them, but sometimes at the expense of accuracy, because stereotypes, being overgeneralizations, just simply aren't true about every single member of that category. So these stereotypes that we have really influence how we perceive individuals. I'm focusing here on white women and underrepresented racial minority people in STEM. The research shows that this implicit bias is reflected in differential evaluation of people depending on the social group they belong to, with some being favored and some being disfavored. And of interest, it can occur independently of whether one personally endorses the stereotype. And it's always interesting to me is that people can explicitly disavow stereotypes. Like in my case, I may say, I totally believe that women have just as much, ability to be a fantastic scientist as men do. We have, there's no reason why not. That's my consciously held firm belief. But maybe, on the implicit side, I did grow up with messages seeing, all the famous scientists that I could name are men. Maybe all my science teachers growing up were men. So somewhere there may be a strong association between men and science more than women in science that could drive an implicit bias for me, despite my explicitly stated beliefs. So these biases in evaluations can occur independently of whether you endorse the stereotype or not. So just to run through a few of these studies with you, and these are really interesting. They call them resume studies, where the idea is you create a set of materials. It could be a resume or an application packet in a hiring context. And you send it out to different individuals, respondents, to evaluate. And for some of those people who are responding to it, you try to identify the applicant as being as one member of one social group or another. For example, one being men, one being woman, as indicated by the name that you put on top of the resume or the application packet, for example, John or Jennifer, with everything else in the materials being exactly the same. So the exact same resume just attributed to either a man or a woman by virtue of the name on top. In this study, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a few years ago, the researchers sent out these identical resumes to science professors across the United States at our one universities, and asked them for feedback on these applications, saying that they were part of a kind of a project for undergraduate students who were applying for a lab manager position, and how they could get feedback on their application materials, and then they'd work with the students on it to help them improve. And so the applications were sent out, the science professors filled them out, filled out the ratings and sent it back. And then the researchers were able to look at how the male and female applicants were being rated. And what they found was a bias favoring the male applicants. That is, when the name on the top was male identified, such as John, those applicants were rated as more competent, more hireable, and more suitable for mentoring. That is, I would give my own, as a mentor, I would give more of my personal time to help that person develop, is evidenced by these graphs on the side, where the darker blue bar is for the applicants believed to be male, and the lighter gray bars were for applicants believed to be female. And this bias even emerged at the level of their recommended starting salary, which is a pretty real life consequence, that men were recommended to have a higher starting salary than women, despite their exactly identical credentials. A couple of things to note about this study is that one is that this was not limited to one type of science professor respondent. Both men and women showed this this type of bias. Also, that it occurred independently of things like their rank. So it occurred equally amongst the untenured assistant professors on through the full professors, and across a variety of STEM fields. This kind of research was also replicated using, in the context of race, by using names such as Jamal and Greg, and being able to show a similar favorability for applicants who have white sounding names compared to those who have black sounding names, even though their resume was otherwise completely identical. This is a study that is similar, but it was about sexual orientation, to see if there was a bias towards straight applicants over LGBT applicants. Of course, in this kind of study, you can't just change the name, right, to indicate somebody is gay or straight. So what they did is they changed a line on the resume to indicate that, to send that message. So one of the lines was treasurer in the gay student organization for some people who read that resume, and other resumes that said the treasurer in the environmental student organization. So this is the cue to indicate that one applicant was gay, or to indicate that that person was straight. And they sent this out actually to real life job ads in 5 different occupations in 7 different states, and then just sat back, after they submitted the resume with this one line in it or the other line, and waited for some kind of response, like a callback in response to that resume from the employers. And what they saw was overall there were 40% fewer callbacks for the applicants when they had the line of treasurer in the gay student organization, compared to the environmental student association, where one might assume that person is straight. There's some regional differences, but it's interesting that one of the largest differences was one of the states was Ohio, which is of course our neighbor to the south. This one I think is really fascinating. It's about sort of an intersection of 2 different identities. That is an intersection between parent status, so people who become a mom or a dad, but then also whether you're a mom or a dad. That is the other social identity being gender. And so researchers here again developed their identical resumes, attributing some of them to women and some of them to men by virtue of the name on top, for example, John or Jennifer. But within that, they also used the other manipulation where they changed a line in the resume here to indicate whether they were a parent or not. And so the line that indicated that they were a parent was that they were active in the parent-teacher association, right? And for other versions of the resume, they just left that line out. So they were able to identify whether women applicants, for example, were identified as mothers or non-mothers, and then whether male applicants were identified as fathers or not fathers, right? And asked them respondents to, again, do the ratings of the applicants on various dimensions. And so what they found when they were evaluating these equally qualified same gender job applicants, that amongst the women, that when the women were identified as being mothers as compared to non-mothers, the mothers were rated as less competent and less committed to their job, to their paid work, were also less likely to be recommended for higher promotion to management, and were offered lower starting salaries than women who were identified as not mothers. And we can think about this as the motherhood penalty, right? That when women become parents, become moms, that people tend to start seeing them differently and less favorably as workers. So what happens with men? Is there a fatherhood penalty? The answer to that is no. It is fathers, the men who were identified as fathers, are now rated as more committed to their paid work, and they're offered higher starting salaries than the non-fathers. So I can hear a schema here, that, oh, when he becomes a father, now, he's a family man, he's got a family to support. There's just a whole different kind of schema around parenthood for men than women. And so the men here didn't experience the fatherhood penalty, rather they experienced what they call a fatherhood bonus. So these schemas can stereotypes we have about different social groups can intersect in these ways and operate differently to favor people and disfavor people based on these schemas and stereotypes we hold about their intersecting identities. Finally, this study is not a resume study, but it's kind of along the same lines. And what researchers did here was, instead of sending resumes out, they sent out email messages to faculty from supposedly from students requesting a 10-minute meeting with them. Okay, so the researchers sent out this barrage of these emails that were, fairly short, but indicated something along the lines on, I'm a student who's interested in graduate studies in your area, in your field of study, and I'm really interested in your work, and I'm going to be in town next Monday, and I just wondered if you had like 10 minutes where I could just stop by, just 10 minutes, and meet you and talk, about your work. And sent that out to all the professors, and then waited to see what kind of response they would get, if any. So this was sent to 6,500 professors across many top universities. So they waited to see what kind of email response. If it was, yes, I'll meet with you, they quickly responded to say, oh, I'm so sorry, my plans changed, but thank you so much for your generosity, but I can't actually meet with you on Monday, right? Because there's not really a student here. Or else the professor might respond that I can't meet with you, sorry, or probably most likely is that they just didn't respond, right? What they wanted to do is see if these differential rates of response, and they really just looked at, did they respond in any way or not, differed depending on who they thought the request was coming from, right? So they manipulated the name on the email message to make it sound like it was coming from either a white person, a Black person, Hispanic, Indian, or Chinese person. And they used both male associated and female associated names within those categories. And the result was that they found a pattern by which faculty did not respond to requests from women and from underrepresented racial minorities at a significantly higher rate than requests from white men. So again, showing a pattern that people might not know they're engaging in, that they in this case were less likely, or maybe another way to put it is more likely to respond in any way to the white men that were emailing them compared to the other groups. I've always been kind of interested in this study because I'm like 90% sure I got this email, because I remember receiving an email that out of the blue years ago and asking me for 10 minutes of my time. And I did respond. So I always felt good about that. I did respond to the email. But at any rate, these are all these studies about implicit biases, are really fascinating. And I put here in the corner this book called Blind Spot, The Hidden Biases of Good People, which is a kind of a popular press book that kind of summarizes this research and the background and the logic behind it. So if anyone, if you're interested really in learning more about implicit bias, I can recommend that book. There's also a website called Project Implicit. So if you just Googled Project Implicit, you can actually take a test that online that can show you the degree to which you have these sort of implicit associations that favor or disfavor one group over another, and you can take a test. And so I would, if you're interested, I would encourage you to take a look at that, because it's really fascinating and can raise your awareness about your own sort of hidden biases that you might not know that you have. Okay. So now I'd like to turn to being the target. This is sort of the flip side. I've been talking about people who hold stereotypes and use them in their reacting to other people. Now I want to look like, oh, what is it if you're on the other end and being the target of other people's biases? There's a lot of work in this area that was first introduced by Claude Steele, a social psychologist who used to be here at the University of Michigan. Before he moved on, but he introduced this idea of stereotype threat to as a significant experience of people who are targeted by stereotypes. A stereotype threat is it's a situation that one finds themselves in, where in his words, he says they become aware of the contingencies of one's identity. That is, you become aware that there's a stereotype about your group that's relevant in this particular situation that I'm in, and therefore other people might be judging me based on it. And that's sort of the threat, especially if it's a negative stereotype, right? A classic example might be a woman taking a math test, right? Because women are stereotyped as being bad at math compared to men. And so when many women sit down and take a math test, they are taking it knowing that, okay, now I'm in a situation where if I don't do well on this test, it's going to look stereotypic of women. Like there's another woman who can't do math. And that is disruptive actually to their performance because of the sort of intrusive thoughts that one has now, concern about that stereotype and possibly fulfilling it in the eyes of other people. So this work shows that just being aware of that there's a negative stereotype about your group can really affect your outcomes, right? And when you're a member of those stereotyped groups. So much of this work is focused on how stereotype threat affects performances. A lot of it concerns test performance. So in this research, I'll just walk through this graph real quickly. What they did here was they looked at groups of Black and white students, undergraduates, taking an intellectual test, so described to them as something diagnostic of their academic ability. And some students were in the threat condition where they were told, and this test, how well you do on it is going to tell us something about how much academic ability you have. So for Black students, they're now performing in a stereotype threat situation, because if they do poorly on it, it will look stereotypic of Black people, of Black students who are seen as not as prepared or not as able as other students, according to the stereotype, right? And they found that, indeed, those Black students did perform worse than the white students under those instructions. For another set of students, though, they told them something different. They said, we're going to give you this test, and it's the exact same test as the other group got. but they gave them the test saying that this is not about anything that can tell us how much academic ability you have. It's really just sort of an assessment, an exploration about how people solve problems. So it's really about sort of your cognitive processing style, not anything about your ability. Now, the threat's reduced, right? Because I can't look stereotype confirming on this test because it's not measuring academic ability. And when they do that, they see that the Black students and the white students perform more similarly. So the Black students perform much better than they did in the threat condition and more like the white students performed. So this is really saying that there's an underperformance for these students when they perform under the specter of that stereotype. And if there are ways that we can reduce that, their concerns about the stereotype and the situation, we can see better performance. We can see that removing the threat can really reveal their true level of performance, their true ability. Again, I can recommend a book to you by Claude Steele, the one who introduced all this work, called Whistling Vivaldi, How Stereotypes Affect Us and What We Can Do, another popular press book that you can order on Amazon. And it also describes, very clearly and compellingly this theory and the research behind it. Okay. Oh, this is an interesting study that was actually done by Margaret Shee, who also used to be here at the University of Michigan, that on stereotype threat, and also looking at the effect of positive stereotypes, because some stereotypes actually are about a group being particularly well suited or doing well in one domain versus other groups. So she looked at the situation of Asian American women who are taking a math test. Okay, look, if you think about that situation, there are Asian Americans, right, who are stereotyped in our country as being really good at math, right? But there are also women who are stereotyped in our country as being bad at math. So she wondered, well, how do the stereotypes operate in this situation, right? Where you kind of have competing stereotypes. So she got in groups of Asian American women to take a math test in the lab. Prior to the math test, though, she had them fill out a questionnaire. And the questionnaire asked them, for one group, asked them questions about gender, relevant to gender. So things like, do you live in a co-ed dorm? What's it like to live next door to people from the opposite gender? Things like that. For another group, they got questions about their ethnic background. So what other languages does your family speak at home? Do you ever go to like cultural festivals from, for people of your culture and things like that to get them sort of thinking about their ethnicity. And then a control group didn't get either set of those questions. So what they found in the study is that after that, when the students took a challenging math test, that compared to the control group, those who were primed to think about their gender, to think about their identity as women, actually perform more poorly on the math test relevant to the control group. So this is similar to stereotype threat situation like I mentioned earlier. But when they thought about their race and ethnicity identity, they actually performed better, right, than those in the control group. Researchers talk about this as but a stereotype threat effect, but there can also be a stereotype boost effect where people's performances become better when a social identity that's sort of where there's a lot of positive expectations is highlighted in the situation. So you could think about, like, we have a lot of performance settings in academics. I'm sure you have them in engineering. We have them in psychology where, for example, people give a job talk or a colloquium or something where if they do that in a non-diverse setting, for example, as a woman speaker where most everyone else in the audience is male, you think about what is going to stand out to her in that situation, would be her gender. And this research shows that those kinds of performances can be diminished. And you could compare that to like if they had the male candidate or speaker who's might be highlighted in terms of a more positively stereotyped identity and how whether that can affect his performance more positively. So it's fascinating to me how what we think about is, performances, test performances, especially as being really indicative of our ability, they're objective, they're fair, but this research shows how much those scores can be pushed around right, by aspects of the social situation that people are in at that time. What is prime for them and what's on their minds. Okay, stereotype cues in our environments. There are lots of features in our environments that can increase the salience of these kinds of stereotypes. And I'll briefly touch on a few of these that I've addressed in my own work. One is where there's a lack of own group peers and role models. So that's where you find yourself in a very non-diverse setting where you stand out in terms of race or gender. And the other one is more about what people around you are doing that might influence that this is a stereotype where you could be a setting where you could be stereotyped. So in our solo status work, a solo person is where you are the only member of your race or gender present in an otherwise homogeneous group. And this is a situation I studied in the lab. And in some of these studies, we focused on Black students. We put them either in a situation in the lab where they were the only Black person there amongst white students, or they were there amongst other Black students. We found that they were in that former solo status situation, that they reported a variety of outcomes, including feeling like that race was a central part of their identity. They felt more like they were a race representative. So I have to represent all people of my race in this setting. And of course, that leads to performance apprehension, because now if I'm going to have to take a test in this setting, it's not just about me, it's about us, right? It's about members of my race. Similarly, women students who were the gender solo, that is, they're with being the only woman in a group of men, reported things like they wished they could change the gender composition to include more women. And when we told them that they were going to be performing a task in that setting, and asked them how well they thought they were going to do, they had lower expectations for their performance when they knew they were going to be the only woman compared to when they thought other women were going to be present. So this is all sort of anticipatory, like about performance. So, but does solo status actually affect their performance in the lab? So we ran some studies showing that, and this is their performance on an oral exam given as either the solo or the non-solo in terms of race. And what we see here is that the performance of African-American students who had to do an oral exam in a group where they were the only Black person was diminished compared to if they got to do that test in a non-solo situation where there are other Black people present. Whereas the difference between those two situations wasn't significantly different for the performance of white students. Similarly, for gender, we also saw that when women had to do a oral exam performance as the solo woman in front of a male audience, they did worse on that compared to when they were in the non-solo situation where they had other women present. And again, men's performance wasn't significantly affected, although it does look a little enhanced when they got to actually perform as the solo male, which is similar to that stereotype boost effect we spoke about earlier. And this kind of effect that you're seeing here, where women's performance is lower for when they're the only woman there, was particularly pronounced when the task they were doing was math related, something where women are stereotyped as being worse performers than men. All right, so to say a few words about the chilly climate here. A chilly climate I see as one where stereotyping of other people is revealed in the subtle things that they say and they do. So it doesn't necessarily, it can be blatant, but it often isn't. It often is something that people is unintentional, but yet reveals the expression of any implicit stereotypes that they may have. And this can contribute to a negative climate for members of those stereotype groups with many negative consequences for their persistence, recruitment, and retention in those fields. A lot of times these are called microaggressions. That is, that when people feel stereotyped by others because they can recognize the expression of a stereotype about their group being directed towards them by the other person, despite whatever intention the other person had, the message is still received by the person in the stereotyped group. Oops, thanks. We ran some studies on this where we exposed people to this this subtly negative treatment of women and in a STEM setting by having them exchange information in a group where they were the only woman. But sometimes they saw another woman being treated in this subtly negative way, in this subtly stereotypic way, or not. And then we assessed their two things. One was a measure of stereotypic information processing. So earlier was a psychological measure of how much we could see that stereotypes were activated for these people. And also measures of their performance, of their persistence and intentions to persist in their STEM fields. These were all female STEM majors. So I'm just going to skip to the end really quick to show you the measures here. So how likely is it you'll pursue graduate studies? How likely is it that your eventual career, each of these will pertain to your STEM field of study? And so what we found was that when women witnessed the negative treatment of other women, they scored higher on that stereotyping measure. So we knew that stereotypes became activated for them compared to people in the control group who did not see that negative treatment. And also they reported fewer lowered intentions to persist. Like they didn't think that they were going to have a career in their current field of study in STEM compared to women who did not witness the subtly negative treatment of other women in that particular STEM setting. So putting these together, we were able to demonstrate that the reason that when women witnessed the negative treatment of other women and it caused them to reduce their postgraduate intentions to persist was linked to the stereotypes being activated for them. So seeing that negative treatment caused the stereotypes to become salient, to become relevant to them, and that made them feel like I'm probably not going to persist in this field. So what can we do? There's two ways to think about this when we think about approaches to intervention. And one of them is trying to do something to make women stronger as they stand up, try to do their jobs and persist in the face of implicit biases and stereotypes. The other way is to try to fix the environment to reduce the influence of these stereotypes and implicit biases. So rather than placing it on the backs of the women, you try to fix the environment that they're in. And so when we examine our environments, we could think about what stereotype cues might be present in our academic settings. I just pulled out a few examples of things that I notice. For example, these STEM department web pages show who's there, and you can kind of see a lack of gender diversity. So if you're a woman considering applying to these fields, you have to, they notice and think about those gender compositions. This picture was taken at a STEM department like student advising office. It's in the waiting room, and if you can read it, there's a little pamphlet that says how to tie a necktie, right? So it's sort of a subtle message, but kind of sends a message that there are who's expected to be there in this STEM department, which is generally men. And these are sort of everywhere. You can see these are pictures of like all the previous chairs of a department or the award winners. And oftentimes they are very homogeneously male or white. And oftentimes they're actually present in performance settings like a colloquium room. And so again, they're sending these sorts of, they're external factors that are sending messages about who's expected to be there, who belongs. This is an even bigger example I took at another university in a department of engineering, where in 110 people, there are only 6 women and I think 1 URM man. So anyway, I will end by really talking about the need for change in environments. There are ways that we can do small things in our environment to change it to be more inclusive by looking at those kinds of small factors, those small cues, those pictures, those pamphlets, and trying to understand how what kind of messages they're sending, and whether they're inclusive to all. We can do more monitoring. We can recruit for diversity and excellence. We can think about how do we highlight the contributions of women and URM scholars into our own curriculum in our classroom. Can we reconsider those walls of fame? So on that, I will end, and I'll be happy to talk more with you about this research and any steps that we can take to make our environments more welcoming to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise, for that wonderful talk. That was just fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd like to start with one question, which has to do with the actions that we can take to reduce the possibility that our implicit biases affect, our actions. Could you speak a little bit more to that?
Sure. Yeah. So how, what can we do as individuals is one way to put it, to not be implicitly biased or implicitly stereotype people. There's a researcher named Patricia Devine at the University of Wisconsin who has I think the most effective model about this, where she talks about 4 stages, and one of them is simply becoming aware of implicit bias, right? That it exists and understanding what that is. And then secondly, understanding that it has negative consequences, like real life consequences for people. So it's not just some minor thing, but rather some people are really significantly and negatively affected by it. Third, becoming motivated internally to not be biased, right? So you taking your own, making it one of your personal values, and I'm going to do my best to not be biased. And then fourth is to actually know what to do to not be biased. And that's the hardest point, right? Is how do we know what to do? I'm motivated. I understand it's a problem. I want to do something about it. And her suggestions were based on some social research findings. She has a series of them in a small toolkit, which I could show later, I guess. But it's steps that we have to think about and practice, because she sees it as stereotyping as like a bad habit that we get into, right? Because it's just easy to fall back on stereotypes. And so to get out of that takes motivation. It's like quitting smoking, right? You got to really want to, and you got to practice, and it's not going to happen overnight. And you got to be thinking about it pretty often. So we have to think about catching ourselves when we're stereotyping, right?
Absolutely.
I just saw myself do that. I made an assumption about somebody based on whatever race or gender, and then how to replace that thought, replace that reaction with a different one, and practice that going forward, right?
Great.
She also talks about like intergroup, increasing intergroup contact, trying to take other people's perspectives, be in their shoes. There's many of these actions, but they all take practice.
Absolutely. And it's a challenging topic, but it's one that we really need to focus on if we want to become more equitable. Related to this, we had a question about trainings, the type of education and training activities that faculty and grad students, for example, they take like mandatory ethics and research training. Are required trainings on implicit bias and the effects of the negative stereotyping provided for university faculty, for administrators, for folks who are decision makers in a given college or department? And, is there any evidence that they work?
Yes, there is. And there's certainly, there's evidence of how they can be done badly. And a lot of that is, a lot of it is around making it mandatory. There's something to that when people don't want to be there, it's not very effective. So you have to figure out a way to make people feel more, like it's something for them, right? Oh, this is something I would be interested in. And that might be related to the other way that they don't work, is when people feel accused, like you're just telling me I'm racist or sexist. And so it's really important that the message behind the workshop is not that I'm trying to call you out as, as being biased, but rather to just make you aware of what what we know about that topic and what our research findings on it. As far as how it's been, whether it's effective or not, we can look to Michigan's advanced program and how they offered workshops in this area, and were able to notice a significant increase from the years before the workshops were offered. And these are around faculty hiring, and that is trying to create more equitable hiring that might produce, for example, more hiring of women. And then the years before the program was introduced were compared to the years after the program was introduced. They saw a significant increase in the hiring of women since the workshops were implemented. And I did some research on that as well and surveyed faculty for those who had attended the advanced workshops and those who hadn't, and found that those who did attend had more favorable attitudes towards diversity and towards efforts that we can take to enhance diversity in hiring, and that those attitudes were based on what they learned in the workshop regarding the social science evidence, much like what I talked about today. And so it's when people become that, they get an education about that and begin to understand the science behind it, that seems to compel their attitudes on whether they're more on board with the diversity initiatives, and therefore those programs can become more successful when they're based on sound social science research evidence.
That's great. And it's good to hear, because at Michigan Engineering, we're planning to provide education programs for everyone, students, faculty, and staff at the College of Engineering. Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question. So could you say a little bit more about the role of the instructors? We're in the classroom, we have our students, and like you said, it's really important that the professors are actually mirroring the student composition. That's one big part of it. What can we do as instructors to help dismantle these stereotypes that you discussed?
Yeah, so I think that one big piece of it is sort of the representation of various people who are contributing to whatever field you're teaching in as role models for those who might be from those groups. So when I'm teaching in psychology, I try to highlight contributions from women and from people of color. And even on the slides that I show, like on my PowerPoint slides, when I'm talking about a particular piece of research that they've done, I put up their pictures, like they take it from the internet, so people can see what identity group they belong to, and really try to create an environment where it seems more like that, for example, in my field, like psychology is something I could do. People like me do that because I'm seeing it here on the slide during the lecture. And I think the more we can do that, and there's some research evidence behind this, it helps people feel greater persistence and more like I could be like that someday. That's a future possible self for me if you can show me the examples of people like me doing it.
That's great. And those are wonderful tips that we can all take into account as we want to make our classrooms more inclusive. So thank you so much, Denise, for joining us today. It was really a pleasure to host you, and thank you for everything that you shared with us today.
Sure, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I hope to see many of you back for the October event. The DI lecture for next month will be on ways to combat anti-Asian hate and harassment on campus. So please consider registering for that event. With that, thank you all for coming, and see you at the next lecture. Bye.
Bye.